Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda. That was a great overview. And I'm actually going to skip the why and, well, I'll go back to this. So there was a study, you're all familiar with what the ERA funds were, right, a few years ago, and the money that it gave to schools. Well, one of the requirements of receiving ERA was that every state had to actually report to the federal government actual dollar school spending at the school level. So up until this time, there had never been a data set that actually looked at real dollars from school to school, and the federal government had not collected that. They had averages and all kinds of different calculations, but not real dollars at the school level. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to find out what were the within district inequities, and specifically they wanted to know how does this apply to Title I schools. Because if you're familiar with Title I spending, right, you're supposed to have comparability, and you're supposed to, it's supposed to be above district and state spending on schools, right? It's supposed to be extra money for low-income kids. And so they wanted to find out, in fact, were Title I schools within districts getting more money? And what do you think happened when they looked at actual spending? Do you think that low-income Title I schools generally were getting more money than other schools, even given the Title I grant that they got? And the answer to that would be no, that in most cases, within district inequities, because of funding based on FTEs instead of actual dollars, meant that in general, lower income schools had less expensive staff and higher turnover, which Title I dollars was not enough money to account for the discrepancies between one school and another within low-income districts. So among districts with at least one Title I school and one non-Title I school at the school grade level, 47% of Title I districts had lower personnel expenditures per pupil in their Title I elementary schools than in their non-Title I schools. And there's a lot of data like that. You can look at the study, but basically they found that the equity they would expect from their comparability rules was not necessarily there. And then here's another example from Education Next. And this was a study that was done specifically in Texas. And basically it wanted to know the same question. What does within district school equity from one school to another look like? And again, within these large school districts in Texas, they actually found that the inequity was highest within districts rather than between districts. And again, this is largely driven by the highest expense of any district is salary and staffing positions. And if you average all of those costs across schools and you don't fund based on student-based characteristics, you run the risk of certain more desirable schools, and I use that term really broadly, generating favorable conditions so that higher paid staff want to work at them over time. And so higher paid staff tend to gravitate toward certain kinds of schools and certain kinds of districts. And you see this happening over and over in districts across the United States. So this is one of the reasons that we talk about student-based budgeting, student-based allocation, student-centered funding, backpack funding, weighted student funding, per pupil funding. There's a lot of names for it, but it is based on the idea that we should be allocating funds based on money that kids generate because it's much more granular and you can actually determine the equity and the transparency better than staffing ratios. So you can imagine like a state like North Carolina, they have a staffing ratio from the state where literally they have the same steps and cliffs, it's just the state directing the number of teachers per student. And so it turns out that North Carolina is one of the most inequitable states in terms of their funding in the United States. And it is purely because they have the most averaged and aggregate kind of funding where you don't actually see dollars that students generate even at the district level. And so that's one of the reasons that we do this. So again, we have an average salary example. There may still be reasons for districts to use average salaries, But we know that if you only fund average salaries, student-based budgeting in combination with average salary is still better than just having the district allocate out positions. Because at least if you actually got the money that your kids generate, you could buy 2 average salaries maybe, or you could have much more flexibility over your position control, even if you haven't moved to charging schools actual salaries. But salaries themselves lead to a lot of inequity when they're just reported out in the aggregate and you don't actually know the spending at the school level. And that tends to be what drives a lot of inequity in the United States in school spending. And we see here, this is an example that my colleague actually created from Texas, but he looked at, what happens when teacher A at one school has an actual salary of $47,000, teacher B has an actual salary of $62,000, but both schools are being charged $54,000. Real money is not going to the school that is being charged. Basically, they're subsidizing the higher salary at the other schools. Now, again, this tends to normalize or equal out, but if we go back to the Title I example, if you get schools that have high numbers of the $47,000 teacher and schools that have high numbers of the $62,000 teacher, over time you're talking about real money and real differences and how much money is available at one school to another. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. That was just an example of why people have moved to this in places like Denver or New York City or Baltimore. Because especially in urban districts, right, they have a lot of low-income students with high needs, and there is a reason that we should be spending more equitably. So, because we do want these kids to have higher student performance. It's about the kids learning, and it's about allocating resources so that kids learn more. And so one of the things that we did at the Reason Foundation is we published a study called the Weighted Student Formula Yearbook. And in the first early years, it just was very descriptive, where we would say, Denver, this is their formula, and they're doing this. And we would just look at district documents and talk to people at the district. But in this last iteration, we wanted to try to see, could we see differences in actual performance from one district to another that was using weighted student formula? And what we did is we used the Broad Prize methodology. And the Broad Prize actually awarded scholarship money to districts across the nation by comparing their student achievement from one district to another. And the way that they did that is by having decile rankings. So obviously you can't compare Colorado's student achievement on their test to California's student achievement. But you can look at, within Colorado, where does Denver rank compared to everyone else in closing the achievement gap? Where do they rank in student improvement? Or in Los Angeles, where does Los Angeles rank? And are they in the bottom decile, or are they in the middle decile? And that's basically taking all the districts and their data in a state and breaking it down into sets of 10, and then finding who's in the top percent and who's in the bottom percent. And that's literally how the Broad Prize works and how they rewarded scholarship money. And they did that with graduation rates and, all kinds of different achievement gaps and overall student achievement, improvement, expected improvement. They have lots and lots of measures so that they aren't just saying, they take into account all of the demographic differences from one place to another and try to make it fair. So it's very complicated, but we decided to look at how do weighted student formula districts do on this Broad Prize methodology. And what we found out is that some districts do pretty well and some districts do not so well. And the grades aren't as important. And literally we just looked at how they ranked on every decile, and we assigned points to the deciles based on the Broad ranking. So in our study, we have pages and pages explaining how we did this. And we had other people look at it and tell us if we were crazy or not and try to vet it. But we think that we came up with a pretty fair methodology in terms of how you compare to everyone else in your state is what this is measuring. And so Houston, which won the Broad Prize, actually is no surprise that on their metric they would be the highest performing district. And a lot of it comes down to how do you serve low achieving students and how much gain do high poverty Hispanic students make in middle school reading. So it's heavily weighted toward academic achievement, the Broad Prize methodology anyway. But one of the things that we wanted to know is, was there a correlation between the amount of money in the student-based allocation and student achievement over time? And so one of the metrics, we did this with a lot of metrics, but this is just one example. We looked at the probability of closing the achievement gaps being predicted by the percent of the budget that the principal had autonomy over. And while it's not a perfect line going up, is what we found is that yes, there was a correlation, and that in general, the more money that a robust student-based budgeting program used, the faster and the higher probability of the achievement gap closing. So again, holding all else constant, a school district that allocated 50% of its 2011 budget is nearly 10 times more likely to close achievement gaps than a district that allocated only 20% of their 2011 budget. But I mean, it's more than just the money though, right? Because this means that all of these other reforms like principal training and being transparent about how money is spent and thinking about how individual schools spend their money to improve student achievement goals, those kinds of things are all going on in these districts, because part of moving to student-based budgeting means that you're having a lot of internal discussions about how resources relate to how you serve kids. So it's not just the money, but there does seem to be a correlation. And then we actually so the Recovery School District was not part of the Broad Prize methodology. And we had to do a FOIA request to get all of their student data for all the districts in the state. And then just recently, in the last year, we've run them through the Broad Prize metric. And so here's, again, looking at improvement over time for disadvantaged student groups. And one of the Broad Prize, they predict the improvement based on your demographics, and then you have your actual improvement. And again, the Recovery School District, which has had very rapid improvement overall. So for instance, there was just a study that came out this week because of the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina that showed that they had a 0.4 standard deviation in student improvement. So separate from our analysis, but looking again at the Recovery School District data in New Orleans, and that is huge. Like if you look at class size reduction, investments in early education, all the things that we typically study for student achievement, almost none of them get close to the threshold of a 0.4 standard deviation in terms of improvement. So in general, New Orleans is literally the fastest improving school district in the nation and has been over the last 5 years. One of the reasons that they've been able to do that, of course, is because they were rock bottom. And it's easier to improve when you're in the very last quartile. So for instance, a move from the 25th to the 40th percentile, that doesn't sound very impressive, but moving 20 percentile points is a lot. Graduation rates, it's across a lot of different things that they've shown this improvement. And so I guess the point is that there has been some student achievement improvement, and it is useful to know how you use your resources at the school level to drive student achievement. And while the principles are equitable funding, portability, school autonomy, transparency, accountability, I mean, I would argue that that's the reason we're doing it, right, is to improve outcomes for kids. We're not doing it to make principals work harder. We're not doing it to make things more confusing. We're doing it because in your family budget, can you imagine if you had to have your food budget aggregated with your neighbor that has 6 kids and that you had to subsidize their food spending based on your 2 kids? You know, no other kind of financing do we not get to the very fine nature of spending at the building, at the unit, right? I mean, you have all kinds of apps on your phone that manages your bank accounts, that manages, and so there's no reason not to do that with schools, and I'm done.
Could you speak in the mic?
Yes, sorry.
That's all we wanted.
You can move it to help you. There you go.
So that's the reason to do this, is that it's time for school finance to join the 21st century. And the panel we're going to hear from this afternoon from Alabue they're really gonna speak to that. Why we want to have more savvy, modern school finance and why that will be helpful. Thank you guys.